Hello, I'm Mark, and welcome to Book Ramble. If you're new, welcome. If you are returning, welcome again. But if you are a subscriber and returning, thank you so much. Your continual support really does make a difference. I'm reading this, Plato's Republic. I don't know how many times I've read it. Not all of it. I've read in the past, especially for my degree in philosophy, I read certain parts of it. And again, I seem to have forgotten quite a lot of it. It's funny, you read a book more than once and you think you've got it in your head, and yet when you reread it, how did I miss that? So it's a big book. It's also probably Plato's most famous. So I have been doing this one. I did the Apology, which was Socrates on trial, sentenced to death. And I'm going to do Crito, which is the follow-up to that, in which Socrates, while languishing in jail, could escape, but he effectively says, no, I'm not going to do that. And the third one would be Phaedo, in which he takes the hemlock. Rather than take that with me in my luggage to go on vacation to the South Island, I took this one. It was easier, and therefore, as I started reading the Republic, thinking I'm going to take my time reading it to do an episode much further down the line, there's so much to say, and because it's broken up into individual books, I thought then why not just do a book at a time? So that's what I'm doing. It's not his later work. His later works are quite difficult to get through. His earlier works are quick and often to the point. The middle bit, which this comes from, the middle period, his works take time to get going. He pads them out a lot more. There's a lot more banter back and forth. And as you read The Republic, Book 1, it does take its time to get going. There's a lot of scene setting, a lot of exposition. So we see Socrates walking down to the Piraeus, which is the port of Athens. There's a festival going on. He's asked to come and speak to somebody in a house, an old gentleman. There's people there. There would have been well-known names at the time. It's like a gathering of the greats. And Socrates gets talking to an old man, and then he has to basically disappear, and da-da-da-da. And then we finally get to the point of Book 1, which is famously known as the Thrasymachus argument. Might is right. The whole thing about the Republic really is what is justice, the just person. And it's probably worth talking about the Socratic dialogue, because in the Apology, we don't really get that. Socrates is on trial, and he's answering at length some of the charges against him. But in this type of dialogue, it's the Socratic method, it's back and forth. So what is the Socratic method? Effectively, Socrates states he knows nothing. And something comes up in which he'll say, so what do you think about this then? And he'll question somebody who normally has a very strong opinion of something. And Socrates would then think, right, okay, so does that mean this? And then the person who's being interviewed gets, confused, and then by slow steps, Socrates goes back and forth, getting opinions fixed as to, do we now think this, and blah, 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 and then moves on, and not always coming to any final decision as to what a thing is. So in this case, what is justice? Well, it never really comes to an end in a lot of the dialogues. There is a lot of strength with the Socratic method. It's become famous. But you can see why he was considered the gadfly, quite an annoying man who wouldn't stop asking what the person being questioned think difficult questions to answer. And it's all based on something that must have really irked Socrates and certainly Plato. So Socrates left no writing. It's Plato writing, but using Socrates' mouth. And the thing is, as you go from the early stages of Plato's writings, it's definitely Socrates' opinions. But as you get further and further down the line towards the end, it just becomes Plato's opinions, and he's using Socrates' mouth mouthpiece to put his own opinions across. At this point, it's probably a mixture of both. But there are problems with the Socratic method. A lot of it's based on ego. So we as people have our opinion, and we often give it. But we don't like to be questioned about it because we feel it undermines our sense of self, often authority in some people. They don't want to be probed as to, have you really thought this through logically to the end? And it can be quite embarrassing. Also, and I've written in the first book here, there are periods with this method in which the author, who is not really writing a proper account of a conversation that happened, and if it is, he's not going to remember everything, so invariably his own opinions are going to come into play. But there's often quite a big leap from a point being made to then an assertion made by Socrates. And I've made note here. So they're talking about justice, and just before that, there's this inference says, then justice is not good for much, but let us consider this further point. It's typical Socrates. And the person being questioned says, certainly, let's move on. And then Socrates does his usual. And he who is most skillful in preventing or escaping from a disease is best able to create one? And the person says, true. How do you get to that end point? And often Socrates or Plato will get Socrates to make a statement that has just been agreed to, and then said, and therefore this. And you think, no. How did you get to that point? But, and then the other point I've put down here, the one question often agrees too easily. There's this back and forth in which one person says, no, I don't agree with you, Socrates, and Socrates keeps going, asking questions, and then eventually, oh yeah, okay then. And no doubt that's an authorial device to get things moving. But it does leave you thinking, if you're studying it, you think, hang on, go back. I'm not sure this person would agree to what you've just said, just like that. And also, and this is the thing about the Socratic method, it often leaves the person that's being questioned confused. This terrible state of confusion. Oh, right. And then is left there hanging. Okay, what is the end point then? I think the problem for some people is that they want an answer. They want the definitive statement made. And often it's not made, because that's the whole point. Socrates famously said, I am wise because I am not wise. People think I'm clever, but because I know nothing. I don't profess to know the answer, but I'm going to make sure, this is Socrates saying this, thinking this, I'm going to make sure that you also come to that conclusion. Stop being so cocksure about you know the answer. I'm going to prove it that you don't. Okay, so bear that in mind. Book 1 is a bit rambling. It goes all over the place. So you're going from outside to inside. You're meeting somebody who then leaves, and somebody else comes in, and there's da-da-da-da-da. It starts off with Socrates on money, which is always, for the last 2,000 odd years, being a perennial kind of pursuit for some people. And he says this, the makers of fortunes have a second love of money as a creation of their own, resembling the affection of authors for their own poems, or of parents for their children. Besides that, natural love of it for the sake of use and profit, which is common to them and all men. And hence, they are very bad company, for they can talk about nothing but the praises of wealth. I've got to be careful now. Everyone's interested in money. I am, but I'm not interested in it at the same time. It's nice to have, because I like to give it away as much as possible. And my family, we've often chortled, especially around where we live. There's many cafes. There's a great thriving cafe culture here in New Zealand. Wherever you go, there's wonderful cafes, great coffee. And the amount of times that we've sat down at a table and you can overhear other people speaking. And the same kind of question or statements keep coming up that we hear all the time. And it's like an obsession with people in New Zealand of a certain cultural background. They tend to be what's known as Pakeha, white settlers, or they have been born in New Zealand, probably second or third generation from immigrants coming in. And they're obsessed with portfolios and how much land they've got and how much money they're making. To the point that when you keep hearing it, you think, oh, think of someone else. I'd love to have a conversation or hear somebody have a conversation about something else. No, they're obsessed with wealth. And I think a lot of it is because New Zealand is very isolated. To get on here, you had to work hard and money was in short supply. And then by the time of the 50s and 60s, and it started to become more liquidity and more wealth and the population was increasing, I think it fixed in people's mind that the only thing that matters is money creation. Not according to Socrates. Eventually, they get onto the topic of the conversation. Now, in this version, it's the 7th page, so it's quite a way in. And Cethalus is speaking. He says something. He says, "To be a good man, that he has had no occasion to deceive or defraud others. And when he departs to the world below, he is not in any apprehension about offerings due to the gods or debts which he owes to men." And the whole debate about what is justice is not owing debt to anybody. That's what the first statement about what is justice, well, it's having no debts. Well said, Cephalus, I replied, this is Socrates. But as concerning justice, what is it? To speak the truth and to pay your debts, no more than this. And even to this are there not exceptions? Suppose that a friend, when in his right mind, has deposited arms with me, that's weapons, and he asks for them when he is not in his right mind, ought I to give them back to him? And then he comes to the conclusion, again, this Cephalus, having made a statement about what he thinks justice is, and then when Socrates says, what about this? Cephalus says, oh, you are right. Instantly. But then, said Socrates, speaking the truth and paying your debts is not a correct definition of justice. Quite correct, Socrates. So this is back and forth about what is justice then? What does it mean? And the question is, before you get going into the book, why justice? Why that topic? What's the just state? What's the just person? What's the just manners that we should have? And it's based all on one thing, I think, arete. Arete obsessed the Greeks to some extent. You see it in Homer, in the Iliad. Arete means what is the proper conduct and behaviour of a person. And of course in Homeric literature, it's slightly different to Plato. In the Iliad, the proper function of a person is to fight effectively and to have martial courage. By the time we get to Plato, certainly through Socrates' mouth, it's what makes us the proper person. Arete becomes linked to what the Romans would call virtus, virtue. What makes a proper person? What kind of dignity should he or her have in life? How should she behave? How should he act in certain situations? And a pen, for instance, a good pen is a pen that works. That's its arete, that's its job, that's its function. A good human, then, what's our function? Well, according to what is unfolded in the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle and Plato's Republic, is to be a virtuous person, to have the cardinal virtues which Plato would later lay out in the Republic. And therefore, as we are all to be the same, that means then our corporate self, which is the city-state, will become the best state, virtue. And that's what it seems to be aiming for at this very early stage. At some length, in Book 1, we get to really the nub of what Book 1 I think is really about. And it's linking justice to human virtue. But we get to page 15, and finally Thrasymachus comes into the fray. Now, Thrasymachus was an historical person, and to understand, I think, why this is being talked about, ever since Socrates was put on trial, found guilty, and had to end his life, that spurred Plato to talk much about philosophy. How could a city-state do such a thing to such a man? And what does that mean about the city-state? And what does that mean about people accepting it, or the run of a city-state or country along a line of what it thinks is the just way, but isn't, because it's based on a weak foundation of what is virtue and justice and truth. And this would have rankled with Plato a lot. Now, Thrasymachus was a real person. As far as we know, he was a sophist, a itinerant wandering man who, for money, would teach the sons of the wealthy. That's something that Plato, or certainly Socrates, did not like, because it meant that they could say anything to the sons. There was no set curriculum or idea of what could or could not be taught. And often it was done to teach the sons to win an argument, even if the argument was incorrect, wasn't telling the truth. And truth is key here. What did Nancy Sinatra say in Boots Are Made for Walking? You should be truthing. So Thrasymachus was real, but he lived sometime before, I think, the era in which Plato was writing. So to put him into the book is putting somebody from the past into a setting that may or may not have been real. It's like somebody writing a gathering of people today and saying Churchill turns up. If I'm correct, there could have been a Thrasymachus who was around at the time, but the Thrasymachus we know of, and there isn't much, he was a well-known rhetorician, and he's been listening on the sidelines, and suddenly comes in and quite bluntly says, all this is nonsense. Everything that's been talked about so far is nonsense. He says, I proclaim that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. Might is right. He said, have you never heard that forms of government differ? There are tyrannies, and there are democracies, and there are aristocracies. The different forms of government make laws. They deliver to their subjects, and him who transgresses them they punish as a breaker of the law and being unjust. In all states there is the same principle of justice, which is the interest of the government. Remember, this is Thrasymachus speaking. Everywhere there is one principle of justice, which is the interest of the stronger. The might is right argument has literally gone all the way through history since this conversation was said to have taken place. And we see it in the playing out of nation states and rulers. If you have somebody in the modern context of a democracy that overreaches or arbitrarily decides certain things in their interest, and it doesn't matter what the effect is on the majority, according to the Thrasymachus argument, that person would be just because might is right. Whoever is the stronger has the right to do that, and that's therefore just. Well, if you know anything about Socrates, you know that's going to be argued against, and the rest of the book is effectively him doing so. So he gives this rebuttal. This is Socrates now saying, do you admit that it is just for subjects to obey their rulers? I do, says Thrasymachus. But are the rulers of states absolutely infallible, or are they sometimes liable to err, to make mistakes? And Thrasymachus says, well, they're liable to, yes. Then, says Socrates, in making their laws, they may sometimes make them rightly and sometimes not. Thrasymachus, true. And then Socrates, and of course, Plato admits afterwards in the writing here that this quick back and forth, for Thrasymachus, it made him very uncomfortable. It took a long time to answer some of the questions. He was like, because he was putting himself into knots and realising, I've been made to look foolish here. But you don't get that as you're reading through initially. So they can make laws contrary to their interest. So Socrates says, the laws which they make must be obeyed by their subjects, and that is what you call justice. Thrasymachus, doubtless. Then justice, says Socrates, according to your argument, is not only obedience to the interests of the stronger, but the reverse. And this is, okay, kudos to Plato here. He has Thrasymachus instantly says, what is that you're saying? What? If you don't like that kind of back and forth, at this point, you'd probably throw the book away in disgust. I find it quite amusing. Socrates says, rulers may sometimes command what is not for their own interest, and that for subjects to obey them is justice. And they get themselves in these knots, these verbal knots, and which is a criticism of philosophy. A lot of it is just verbiage. It's playing on words, getting words misunderstood or to use certain words, which Wittgenstein loosely called language games. We're playing a game with language. There's a piece here, and I've written it down as Plato making an apology for Socrates here. So this is Socrates answering. Indeed, Thrasymachus, and do I really appear to you to argue like an informer? Certainly, he replied, because by this stage Thrasymachus had enough of him. And do you suppose that I ask these questions with any design of injuring you in the argument? Nay, he replied, suppose is not the word. I know it. But you will be found out, and by sheer force of argument, you will never prevail. This, I think, is Plato relating or giving a nod and a wink to the trial of Socrates. He annoyed people because of this. And Thrasymachus, he gets quite blunt and aggressive, interestingly, since he's arguing might is right. He has followed Socrates' rebuttals to his main point, and he doesn't like it. And then we have this quite strident part of the book towards the end. Thrasymachus says, tell me, Socrates, have you got a nurse? And Socrates says, why do you ask such a question, when you ought rather to be answering my question? Because, says Thrasymachus, she leaves you to snivel, and never wipes your nose. She has not even taught you to know the shepherd from the sheep. Well, what makes you say that? Said Socrates. Because you fancy that the shepherd or neatherd fattens or tends the sheep or oxen with a view to their own good, and not to the good of himself or his master. And you further imagine that the ruler of states, if they are true rulers, never think of their subjects as sheep, and that they are not studying their own advantage day and night. He is the stronger, and his subjects do what is for his interest. The just is always a loser in comparison with the unjust. Wherever the unjust is the partner of the just, you will find that when the partnership is dissolved, the unjust man has always more and the just less. Income tax. The just man will pay more and the unjust less. He makes an argument here, Thrasymachus, that I think hits home even now. There are some people who believe that to make money you should be criminal. And Thrasymachus highlights that, and he says, well, you can see why. That highest form of injustice, in which the criminal is the happiest of men, and the sufferers, or those who refuse to do injustice, are the most miserable. When a man, besides taking away the money of the citizens, has made slaves of them, then, instead of these names of reproach, he is termed happy and blessed, not only by the citizens, but by all who hear of his having achieved the consummation of injustice. Injustice, when on a sufficient scale, has more strength and freedom and mastery than justice. Justice is the interest of the stronger, whereas injustice is a man's own profit and interest. Makes you wonder whether we've learnt anything. Because Socrates will go to refute all that. And yet, isn't the case today that a lot of people in power are only in it for themselves, that they're not interested in the community? I mean, the amount of people that get promoted to certain positions in governments around the world and then have to leave because of embezzlement or criminality is unbelievable. But what is the ideal ruler then? And we get a little snippet of that at this early stage. So Socrates effectively says, ambition and avarice are held to be a disgrace. For this reason, good men do not wish to be openly demanding payment for government and so to get the name of hirelings, nor by secretly helping themselves out of the public revenues to get the name of thieves. And not being ambitious, they do not care about honour. They must be induced to serve from the fear of punishment. In other words, he's saying, if you want a leader, get the person who doesn't want to do it. The worst part of the punishment is that he who refuses to rule is liable to be ruled by one who is worse than himself. The fear of this induces the good to take office, as a necessity. If a city were composed entirely of good men, then to avoid office would be as much an object of contention as to obtain office is at present. The true ruler is not meant by nature to regard his own interest, but that of his subjects. And of course, by the time you get to page 35 of book 1, Thrasymachus is sweating cobs here. I mean, he's pouring down his face. He can't stand it anymore, and he realises that his argument has been made to look foolish if you accept what Socrates says. But whether the just have a better and happier life than the unjust is a further question. And then he highlights here where he's going to be taking the argument. It's about the rule of human life. Justice is the excellence of the soul, and injustice the defect of the soul. The just soul and the just man will live well. The unjust man will live ill. He who lives well is blessed and happy, and he who lives ill the reverse of happy. The just is happy, and the unjust miserable. Happiness is profitable. And this is what ends book 1 by saying, I know not what justice is, and therefore I am not likely to know whether it is or is not a virtue, nor can I say whether the just man is happy or unhappy. The inquiry, in effect, has just started, even though you are 41 pages in of quite a large book, and there's a long way to go. So book 1, famous for the argument about might is right. You're introduced to the Socratic method, back and forth, and how it irritates people. Makes them... The weakness of the Socratic method, that often jumps are made too easily, too far. And of course, Socrates had lived through periods in his own life in which Athens fell into tyranny. And people who were reading this would have known that. They would have known of the problems with democracy versus tyranny, and that tyranny, the rulers are happy because might is right for them, and everybody else is a chattel or a slave. But ultimately, even though the ruler is happy, they're not. Their soul's not happy, because the just person should have a virtuous soul. And that's what the book will talk about later, the Republic. So I'll end it there and do another one when I've read and made notes of book 2. Fascinating book. Difficult, but timely. It's always timely to read this book, whatever the era. Because the arguments that are in here, we face continually. This slow slide in which rights are taken away, that people then start to believe that they're in charge, in control, and what they do is just, and so long as they're making money, then sod everyone else. And that is something that if you study something like this, you become aware of. It's often in the news, but many people, if you'd not studied it, would go over your head. Well, there's bonus. I don't know if it's actually good to know that, but it's certainly worthy. It's not for everyone, the Republic. They do say philosophy are footnotes to Plato, and this is his most famous work, and therefore I think it's worthy of a read. Anyway, if you got this far, please leave a comment. Do you believe that might is right, or do you accept what Socrates did and how he did it was correct? I'd be fascinated to have your opinions. Otherwise, ta-ta for now.